At a luxury gala, a young black waitress stops beside a billionaire and quietly says, "My father had that same birthmark." The room keeps buzzing. But his world stops cold. One sentence, two strangers, and a buried truth that could shatter everything. If this real-life story gripped you, hit like, subscribe. And tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? The clink of cutlery, the hushed murmur of conversations, and the distant velvet notes of a jazz quartet form the familiar symphony of the Zenith Charity Ball, a gala held annually in the shimmering grand atrium of the Thorne Nexus Tower in Metropole City. Elias Thorne, a titan of industry whose name graced half the soaring edifices downtown, sat at table 7, a silver fork paused mid-air, a perfectly grilled scallop awaiting its fate. His life was a meticulously curated tableau of control precision and unwavering success. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing truly unexpected ever penetrated the gilded cage of his existence. Then a voice, clear despite its tremor, sliced through the elegant din. "Good evening, sir. My late father had the same birthmark. Right there." Elias Thorne froze. The fork, an extension of his own unyielding will, hung suspended. He lifted his gaze, meeting the intense, unwavering eyes of the young woman standing beside him. She was a waitress, impeccably dressed in a crisp black uniform, her hand steady as she held a heavy crystal pitcher of water, yet a subtle tremor betrayed the seismic shift within her. Her eyes, startlingly direct, were fixed not on his face, but on the inside of his left wrist. He blinked once, then slowly, almost wearily, his own eyes followed her gaze. There it was. A faded crescent-shaped birthmark barely the size of a dime, a faint shadow on the pale skin just above his pulse point. He had been born with it, a part of him so intrinsic, he had never once given it a second thought. Not until now. The moment stretched thin and fragile as if the very fabric of the evening had torn. Around them, the ballroom buzzed with laughter, the soft chimes of glasses, the low, comforting hum of jazz. But at table 7, time itself seemed to stop. Elias slowly lowered his fork, placing it gently beside his untouched plate. His voice, when it came, was measured, controlled, a testament to decades of disciplined self-possession. "I'm sorry," he said. The young woman Coraline took a small step back, her apron brushing the edge of the crisp white tablecloth. Her hand still gripped the water pitcher tightly, but the words once uttered hung heavy in the air between them, an unexpected weight that could not be retracted. I didn't mean to disturb you," she said quickly, a flush rising to her cheeks. "It's just, my mom used to say, if I ever met a man with a birthmark like that right on the wrist, I should remember it, because my father had one too." Elias's gaze sharp and piercing through the polite veneer he had cultivated for so long. His longtime assistant, a man of discreet efficiency named attorney Arthur Caldwell, seated to his right, leaned in immediately, murmuring something curt and cautionary. Elias didn't respond. His focus, absolute and unnerving, remained solely on Coraline. He was not angry, nor was he amused. He was stunned. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words materialized. The silence that followed was not empty, but thick with unspoken possibilities. Coraline, feeling the sudden suffocating weight of his intense scrutiny, nodded, swallowed a breath that felt too big for her lungs, and took another step back. She turned her movements stiff and made her way towards the kitchen entrance. As she walked, the sounds of the room crashed back into her ears, a jarring cacophony after the profound quietude of their exchange. She felt eyes on her, some curious, some dismissive, others simply indifferent. But she kept walking, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the swinging kitchen doors. Behind her, Elias watched her go. His shoulders had stiffened, a subtle tension settling into their usual relaxed posture. His left hand almost unconsciously drifted towards his wrist, his thumb brushing across that small, familiar mark. He hadn't thought about Adeline in years, decades in fact, and suddenly her name slammed into him with the force of a tidal wave. Adeline Hayes, Azalea Coast, 2001. The girl with the paint-stained hands and eyes like the fading edge of dusk. The girl his family had warned him would ruin him. The one he had let walk away because he hadn't had the spine, the moral courage to stand beside her. Adeline. She was the one who had vanished from his life just months after their quiet, heartbroken goodbye on that old stone bridge by the Willow Creek River. She had never told him she was pregnant. He had never known. Now here was this young woman, Coraline, her voice, her defiant posture, the quiet fire in her eyes. Something deep inside him shifted. Could it be? But no, it was impossible, wasn't it? He clung to the cold logic of impossibility, even as a tendril of desperate hope began to unfurl within his chest. Elias did not speak again for the remainder of the dinner. He merely sat a silent monolith amidst the celebratory din, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of past regrets and impossible presentiments. Meanwhile, Coraline, having retreated to the staff corridor, stood silently at her locker. The sharp-clipped words of her manager, a woman whose name she could barely recall, drifted in and out of her awareness, unprofessional boundaries, VIP experience. None of them stuck. She was numb to the reprimand, to the implied threat of dismissal. All she could think about was the look in the man's eyes. Not anger, she realized now, not even annoyance. It was recognition, the kind of look you give a memory that refuses to die, that haunts the quiet corners of your soul. That night, as the metropole city wind curled its way through the narrow alleys of the South Side district, Coraline sat alone in her small room. She didn't cry. She didn't pick up her sketchbook, a habit she usually turned to in times of emotional turmoil. She simply stared at the small creased photograph of her mother taped to the corner of her mirror. Adeline, age 21, holding baby Coraline swaddled in a hospital gown, her own face pale but radiant with new motherhood. Coraline reached into her drawer and unfolded a yellowed envelope with no address, no stamp. A letter her mother had written but never sent. The words, faded with time, were still achingly clear. To the man who never knew, if our daughter ever finds you, please be kind. Please be better than silence. Coraline's voice cracked as she whispered to the empty air, the words, a raw, fragile confession. I think I found him, Mom. And somewhere across the sprawling, indifferent city, in a penthouse cloaked in glass and silence, Elias Thorne stood alone by the vast window, the moonlight bathing his left wrist, exposing the faded crescent mark. He stared at it as if seeking answers in its ancient lines. And for the first time in decades, his heart, which he had long ago encased in layers of ambition and control, whispered a name. He thought he'd forgotten a name that felt both alien and intimately familiar aid in that silent, profound exchange between a girl holding on to her mother's final desperate words and a man finally facing the crushing weight of all he had lost. Something unspoken, something broken for too long was beginning to heal. Elias Thorne hadn't left his penthouse since the Zenith Charity Ball. The city outside his floor-to-ceiling windows shimmered with ceaseless movement, a vibrant tapestry of lights and lives. But inside his personal sanctuary was utterly still, like the paused breath between an inhale and an exhale. He hadn't eaten dinner. He hadn't checked the messages blinking insistently on his phone, the demands of his empire, now trivial and distant. He just sat in his oversized leather armchair, elbow resting on his knee, fingers tapping gently on the soft patch of skin on his left wrist. That girl, Coraline. Her voice hadn't left his ears, a haunting melody that resonated with buried regret. Her face, vivid and insistent, haunted his mind. And that name, Adeline Hayes. He hadn't uttered it aloud in 21 years. Not since the humid, languid summer she had disappeared from his life. He closed his eyes, and the ghost of Azalea Coast came rushing back, not as a vague memory, but as a visceral, all-consuming experience. Humid evenings, the incessant chorus of crickets in the ancient magnolia trees, and Adeline standing barefoot in his family's meticulously manicured garden. She used to hum when she painted, oils mostly, bold colors, unapologetic strokes. He loved that about her. How she never apologized for being visible, for taking up space, for radiating an authenticity that both captivated and terrified him. Until his father saw them together, until the phone calls started hushed and threatening, until he was summoned to the family estate, a bastion of old money and rigid expectations, and told in no uncertain terms, "You are not to disgrace our legacy with this entanglement." He hadn't fought it. He had convinced himself it was easier that way, a path of least resistance. He had let the weight of his family's expectations, the allure of his predetermined future, crush the burgeoning love he felt for Adeline. She had left town without a word a few weeks later. He never knew why. He never had the courage to find out. Not until now. He opened his laptop, his hands stiff with a hesitation he hadn't felt in years, a profound unease that rattled his very core. Slowly, deliberately, he typed her name into the search bar, Adeline Hayes, Azalea Coast, Georgia. A few records popped up. His breath hitched. An obituary. 8 years ago. Cervical cancer. Survived by one daughter, Coraline Adeline Hayes. No father listed. His throat tightened, a sudden suffocating constriction. He clicked on the obituary photo. It was her. Older, yes, the years having etched new lines onto her face, but those same luminous eyes, that same slight endearing tilt of the head. The name of the funeral home appeared at the bottom of the page, Evergreen Memorial, Azalea Coast. He closed the laptop, letting the lid fall with a soft thud. He sat back in his chair, the plush leather suddenly feeling like an unyielding surface, and whispered aloud the words, a raw confession to the silent room. She never told me. Across town, in a cozy, cluttered kitchen that smelled faintly of simmering herbs, Coraline stirred her soup absently at Miss Anya Sharma's kitchen table. The old woman, a surrogate grandmother and steadfast confidant, stood over the stove, her back slightly hunched, thick glasses perched on her nose as she stirred something in a pot, her movements slow and comforting. He saw it, Coraline said softly, the words barely a whisper. The birthmark. Miss Anya didn't turn, immediately continuing her rhythmic stirring. He didn't say anything. Coraline continued, her voice tinged with a fragile wonder, but I saw the way his hand shook. Miss Anya finally turned around, holding a wooden spoon, her eyes shrewd and kind fixed on Coraline. Some men shake because they've seen a ghost child, she said, her voice raspy with age and wisdom. Others because they see truth too late. Coraline looked up, her face pale under the soft kitchen light, her brow furrowed with a question that had lingered for years, unspoken, aching in her heart. Did she ever tell you who he was? Miss Anya sighed a long, contemplative sound. She said his name once years ago, Elias. She paused, then added, I didn't know the last name until she showed me a photo in some magazine. He was just starting out, then building his empire, already a name mentioned in the whispers of high finance. She said he had kind eyes, but a weak backbone. Coraline gave a short, sharp breath, a sound of surprise, mixed with a bitter understanding. She never told me that. She didn't want you hating a ghost, Miss Anya replied, her gaze softening. And she sure didn't want you chasing one. I'm not chasing anyone, Coraline insisted, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. But I deserve to know where I come from, don't I? Miss Anya nodded slowly, a gesture of profound agreement. You do, but you need to decide what you're after. Truth and justice. She said, her voice gentle but firm. They don't always look the same. The next morning, Elias Thorne sat in his private office on the 38th floor of the Nexus Tower, files scattered across his polished mahogany desk. He had called in his personal investigator, a retired federal agent named Detective Cyrus Vance, a man who owed him more favors than he could count, a man whose silence was as valuable as his efficiency. I need confirmation, Elias said, sliding the printed obituary and the small grainy photo of Adeline across the desk. Her mother, Adeline Hayes. I need everything. Where she lived when she died, where the daughter's been. Cyrus Vance, ever discreet, raised an eyebrow, a subtle query in his gaze. Is this legal or moral? Elias met his eyes, unyielding. I'm not asking for surveillance. He stated, his voice low, his resolve absolute. I'm asking for clarity. Cyrus nodded, acknowledging the distinction. Give me 48 hours. Elias leaned back in his chair, but he couldn't sit still. His mind kept drifting to Coraline's face, to the way she hadn't looked like she wanted anything from him. That alone made it worse. He wasn't used to being unneeded, to encountering someone who didn't seek his power or influence. It was unsettling, disarming. He picked up the letter again, the one that had been tucked into the digital file Cyrus Vance had scanned years ago, but which Elias had never bothered to read until now. It was one Adeline had written in 2002, in faded ink. The first line, stark and searing, read, You never fought for me, but I hope you'll fight for her if she finds you. He set the letter down, the weight of her words heavy on his soul, and pressed his fingers to his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt the overwhelming, suffocating weight of a life half-lived, a life built on evasion and omission. That night, Coraline sat on her bed, the laptop warming her knees, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. She had typed and erased the same sentence 10 times, the words forming and dissolving like smoke. I think I know who my father is. She switched tabs, clicking through article after article about Elias Thorne. His public persona was a meticulously crafted tapestry of power and philanthropy. A story caught her eye, an old interview where he mentioned he spent summers in Azalea Coast during college. Another article quoted him saying, We build luxury on forgotten land. Forgotten land. Her stomach turned. She thought of her mom, how hard she'd worked at the downtown art studio, then taking on waitressing shifts after the cancer got worse. How Adeline had always said, "You don't need a name to know your worth." And yet, here Coraline was chasing one. She felt a profound dissonance between her mother's quiet dignity and the glaring absence of a father who had built an empire, perhaps on the very ground her mother once called home. She clicked open a new blog draft, hesitantly titled it, "The Girl with No Father and a Birthmark Full of Questions." Her fingers, usually nimble with a paintbrush, flew across the keys, a torrent of words pouring onto the digital page. "I met a man last night. He didn't recognize me, not truly, but I think he recognized something. A mark on his wrist, and maybe something more. Something that echoed in his eyes. I was raised never to expect, never to demand to find my worth within myself. But maybe it's time I demand the truth. This isn't a story about wanting money, about seeking a handout or a shortcut. It's about identity. It's about a girl who grew up in silence, a gaping hole where a father should have been, and a man who may have built empires on forgetting her mother. So if you're reading this, Mr. Thorne, I'm still here, and I have questions that won't stay buried anymore." She hit save draft, not publish, not yet, but it was coming. Because the silence, the void where her father should have been, was becoming too loud to bear. Elias didn't sleep that night either. The Metropole city lights flickered below his penthouse window like restless thoughts never settling. After Coraline had drifted from his line of sight at the gala, after her voice had triggered a name he'd buried for 2 decades, he couldn't ignore the pull anymore, the insistent gnawing of a past denied. By morning, a slim file rested on his desk. Detective Cyrus Vance was fast, remarkably so. Inside were hospital records from Azalea Coast, General Adeline's death certificate property tax records for a modest apartment in Metropole City's south side, and most chillingly of all, an old kindergarten enrollment form from 2007. Under father's name, the line was left blank. But there, clipped to the last page, was a photo taken just days ago, Coraline stepping out of a subway station, headphones in a sketchpad tucked under her arm. She looked nothing like the vibrant, free-spirited girl he remembered, not in feature, not overtly. But something in her walk, her shoulders slightly squared despite the wind, her gaze steady despite the world rushing around her, it was Adeline, undeniably. Elias sat back in his chair, the file open on his lap, and whispered aloud, the words escaping him like a confession. "Why didn't you tell me?" But deep down, a part of him knew. Because she tried, and he had been too cowardly to open the letters, too afraid to confront the consequences of his actions. Or maybe he admitted to himself with a crushing wave of honesty he hadn't wanted to be reminded of the one part of his past, not polished, not public, not meticulously planned. Coraline didn't tell anyone she'd gone to the Metropole City Public Library that afternoon. She found herself drawn there not for books, but for memory, for a quiet, hallowed space to think, to process, to simply breathe. In the quietest corner of the archives, she sat at a microfilm machine, its hum a comforting drone, as she scrolled through old Azalea Coast newspapers from 2001. She didn't know what she was looking for exactly. Maybe a name, a mention, something, anything that would connect the fragments of her mother's past to the man she now suspected was her father. And then there it was. A brief article buried on page 6 of the Azalea Coast Chronicle, July 2001. Thorne Development announces Riverside Project. The image was black and white, grainy with the passage of time, but she recognized him. Elias, younger, leaner, standing next to a small group of city officials. And in the far left edge of the photo, barely visible, a shadowy figure, her mother, an easel behind her, a single paint-smeared hand frozen mid-wave. Her mother had been there at the announcement of his grand project. Not just a bystander, not a fleeting acquaintance. Coraline zoomed in until the image pixelated into a blurred abstraction. Her heart pounded a frantic drum against her ribs. Beneath the photo, a caption, "Local artist Adeline Hayes assists with mural concept." And that was it. No mention of what came next. No word on how Adeline left town. No headline screaming that she'd been erased from the story before it was ever truly written. Coraline sat back, her hands trembling, her throat thick with a mixture of shock and a slow-burning anger. All her life, she'd believed her father had simply disappeared, a ghost in her mother's past. But what if it wasn't that simple? What if someone had made her mother disappear instead? What if the silence wasn't accidental, but deliberate, a byproduct of ambition and power? The next morning, her blog post was no longer a draft. Coraline hit publish. Within hours, it had gone viral across small, interconnected corners of the internet forums for children of absent parents, communities of Black artists, and even a few thoughtful think pieces on wealth responsibility and the insidious nature of forgotten histories. Elias read it at his desk, every searing word. I don't want inheritance. I don't want headlines. I want answers. I want to know if the man with the billion-dollar buildings remembers the woman with paint on her hands. And if he doesn't, I want him to try. He closed the laptop slowly, the sound a soft click that echoed in the vast silence of his office. Something inside him settled a long-held tension finally releasing, and something else, something calcified and brittle cracked. He had spent years building an empire, adding zeros to his name, sculpting an image of unwavering control and impenetrable silence. But none of it had prepared him for a 21-year-old voice, raw and unyielding, asking if he remembered love, if he remembered the cost of his choices. He called Cyrus Vance again. "I need the contact number for Coraline Hayes." "Why?" Cyrus asked, his voice betraying a hint of surprise. "I'm requesting a meeting." Cyrus paused, sensing the profound shift in his employer's demeanor. "Sir, may I ask what you are hoping she'll say?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the sprawling city, a world he had bent to his will, a world that suddenly felt hollow. Finally, he said, his voice quiet but resolute, "I'm not hoping for anything. I'm hoping to listen." When Coraline received the call from an unknown number, she didn't answer at first. She let it ring her finger hovering over the screen, a sense of premonition tightening her chest. The voicemail was short, the male voice steady calm and utterly devoid of arrogance. "Miss Hayes, this is Elias Thorne. I'd like to speak with you privately at your convenience." She didn't call back that day, or the next. Instead, she took the train across town back to Miss Anya Sharma's apartment, a sanctuary of warmth and unwavering support. She found the older woman pruning her front window plants, her movements slow and deliberate, humming an old Ella Fitzgerald tune. "He reached out," Coraline said, standing hesitantly in the doorway, her voice quiet, almost breathless. Miss Anya didn't turn, continuing to carefully snip a withered leaf. "And what did you say?" "Nothing yet." Miss Anya finally turned, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "That's still saying something." Coraline stepped inside, dropping her bag near the couch, and lowered herself into the armchair across the room, the worn fabric of familiar comfort. "Do you think he knew?" she asked quietly, the question heavy with a lifetime of longing and resentment. "All this time, I think some men don't ask the question because they're afraid of the answer," Miss Anya replied, her gaze distant as if observing a universal truth. "And others because they already know." Coraline looked out the window. A kid on a bike rode past, laughing, the sound innocent and carefree. Somewhere in her chest, a sharp ache twisted a complex knot of emotions she couldn't untangle. "Do I meet him?" She asked the words in admission of profound uncertainty. Miss Anya's eyes met hers. "That depends. Are you looking for a father or just the truth?" Coraline didn't answer. She didn't know. The two concepts felt inextricably linked, yet impossibly separate. Later that evening, she stood on the corner of Jackson and 19th, the cool evening air biting at her cheeks, her phone in hand, the screen glowing, a single number displayed. One number, one chance. She dialed. It rang only once. "Mr. Thorne," she said softly, the name feeling foreign on her tongue, heavy with unspoken history. A pause. "Yes, Coraline." She nodded, then remembered he couldn't see her. "Yes, I got your message." "I appreciate that," he said, his voice calm, polite, but not cold. It held a vulnerability she hadn't expected from a man of his stature. "Would you allow me to meet you tomorrow morning, just to talk?" Coraline hesitated. The word caught in her throat, a lifetime of silence, of waiting, of wanting, holding it hostage. But then she remembered her mother's letter, yellowed and fragile, the words, a silent plea, "Be better than silence." "Yes," she said the word, a quiet act of defiance, of courage. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., I'll send you the cafe address." And as she hung up, something heavy inside her loosened. Not disappeared, not yet, but moved, shifted, making room for possibility. Tomorrow would come. And with it, maybe the beginning of something that had been denied to them both for far too long. The bell above the cafe door gave a soft chime as Coraline stepped inside. It was a small corner place on the south side, not far from the old art supply store her mother used to frequent. The wood-paneled walls were lined with local paintings, some vivid and modern, pulsing with contemporary energy, some so old they looked like memories themselves, faded yet resonant. She had chosen this cafe deliberately. If she was going to face the man who might be her father, she wanted the walls around her to remember her mother, to echo with the familiar comfort of artistic expression. Elias Thorne was already seated in the back alone. No assistant, no briefcase, no entourage. Just a dark wool coat folded neatly over the chair beside him, and a porcelain cup untouched on the small round table. He seemed almost diminished without the usual trappings of his power, a man stripped down to his essence. Coraline hesitated for just a second, a flicker of doubt, then crossed the room, her footsteps surprisingly steady. He stood when he saw her, a gesture of respect, a silent acknowledgement. "Coraline," he said, softly her name, a quiet breath in the intimate space. She nodded. "Mr. Thorne." He gestured to the seat across from him. She sat without taking off her coat, a silent shield. Neither spoke at first. The silence this time was different from the one at the gala. It was not born of shock, but of an immense shared weight. Coraline didn't want to go first. She had gone first her whole life. First to ask, first to care. First to be left waiting. Let him speak. Elias cleared his throat, a small nervous sound that seemed out of place for a man of his stature. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said. Coraline looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unflinching, direct. "I didn't do it for you." He accepted that, his expression unreadable, a slight tightening around his jaw. "I understand." Silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was heavy, shared, a silence born of mutual burden of a past that had shadowed both their lives. "I read your blog," he said finally, his voice low, almost a murmur. "All of it. Then you know why I'm here." Her voice was firm, resolute. He nodded slowly. "You want answers." "No," she said, her voice sharpening a steel edge beneath the quiet surface. "I deserve them." His jaw tightened further, a muscle twitching beneath his skin, but he didn't argue. He simply accepted her declaration, her rightful demand. "I didn't know about you," he said. After a beat, his gaze fixed on the table between them, as if examining the wood grain for explanations. "Not until the other night, when you said what you said. I saw her. I saw Adeline in your face, in your eyes, in your spirit. And that shook me in a way I wasn't ready for." Coraline blinked fast, but she didn't look away. Her voice, though softer now, held a quiet challenge. "You say you didn't know. But did you ever wonder?" He met her gaze, his eyes clouded with a profound regret. "Yes." He admitted the word, a quiet confession. "In the early years, I did. After Adeline left, I thought about it. I considered reaching out. But my life, my family." He stopped himself, cutting off the well-worn excuses before they could fully form. "That's not an excuse. I was a coward." "Yes." Coraline whispered the single word, a quiet, devastating affirmation. "You were." He nodded, accepting the truth of her judgment, the weight of his past failures. "And I will live with that for the rest of my life." The coffee between them went cold untouched, as if the profound emotional chill had seeped into the very atmosphere of the cafe. "She painted you, you know," Coraline said suddenly, the words bursting forth unexpected like a hidden spring. "My mom. She painted you even when she hated herself for it. Every canvas was a memory you didn't earn." Elias's throat moved a visible swallow, but he said nothing. He simply absorbed the painful truth. The depth of her mother's lingering connection, her unrequited grief. "She said you had kind eyes." Coraline added, her voice more brittle now, teetering on the edge of tears. "I never believed her. Until now." Elias leaned forward, his elbows on the table, hands clasped tightly, a posture of supplication. "I would give anything to undo what I failed to do back then," he said, his voice raw with regret. "But I can't. All I can offer now is whatever truth acknowledgement or presence you'll allow me to give." Coraline stared at him, studying every line in his face, the fine wrinkles near his eyes, the silver near his temples, the subtle weight of time, and perhaps of newfound burden. "I'm not here for your money or your name," she said, her voice clear, resolute. "I don't want a house or a trust fund." "I believe you," he said quietly, his gaze steady. "I just want to know." Her voice caught a sudden tremor, threatening to overwhelm her, but she steadied it, summoning a deep reservoir of strength. "Did you love her? Did you love my mother?" He didn't look away. His eyes, though shadowed with regret, were unwavering. "Yes, I did." He confessed the words, a long-delayed truth. "More than I had words for back then. More than I had the courage to admit. Coraline's eyes welled, but she blinked the tears away before they could fall, refusing to let them betray the quiet strength she had cultivated. "And me?" she asked, even softer now, the question fragile with vulnerability. "Do you think if you'd known, would you have wanted me?" Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph, creased and faded with the years. He placed it gently on the table between them. Coraline leaned forward, her breath catching. It was a black and white photo of Adeline standing barefoot beside a river, her silhouette unmistakable against the bright water. And she was pregnant, her hands resting gently on her belly. She looked radiant, strong, beautiful, and utterly alone. "She sent this to me once," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper, thick with buried emotion. "It came in a batch of letters my old assistant had held back from me. I only found them after he passed away last month. A box marked 'Do Not Forward' showed up at my office. This photo was inside." He looked at Coraline, his eyes filled with a raw honesty. "I never opened her original envelope back then, even when I saw her handwriting. I told myself it was easier. That not knowing kept me safe. But the truth is, I didn't want to know, because knowing would have made me accountable. And I was a man too weak to be accountable." He exhaled slowly. "I'm not asking you to forgive that, Coraline," he said, his gaze pleading. "But I am asking if you'll let me try now." For a long, profound moment, Coraline couldn't speak. The room felt smaller, the light streaming through the window seemed more golden, and her mother's voice echoed again in her memory, a gentle guiding whisper. "If he ever shows up, don't hate him. Just ask him if he's different now." She met his eyes again. "I don't hate you," she said, the admission surprising even herself. "But I don't know you, and I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to decide today," he said gently, his voice kind, understanding. "Or tomorrow. I'll take what you offer." The waitress brought fresh coffee, but neither reached for it. The moment was too fragile, too significant for such mundane distractions. Finally, Coraline reached into her bag and pulled out a small hand-drawn sketch, its edges worn from years of being carried. She placed it beside the photo, her hand trembling slightly. It was a portrait of Adeline, smiling, her head tilted, and a faint moon-shaped birthmark drawn on the wrist of the woman's imagined companion. Elias stared at it. His hands trembled as he touched the edge of the paper, the simple lines conveying a heartbreaking innocence, a child's unspoken wish. "You drew this?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I was 10, Coraline said, her voice soft, distant. "I didn't know what you looked like, so I made you up. I imagined a kindness my mother spoke of." He swallowed hard, the silence stretching again between them, filled with the weight of that imagined kindness. "You gave me more kindness than I deserved," he whispered, his voice raw. She stood, slipping her bag over her shoulder, ready to leave. "This isn't kindness," she said, her voice steady, now resolute. "This is memory. This is truth." He nodded, accepting her terms. "Will you let me see you again?" "I don't know," she said, pausing at the door, her hand on the cool metal handle. "But I'll think about it." She turned to leave, pausing only once at the threshold, her final words hanging in the air, a challenge and a statement of profound independence. "I don't need a father. I never had one, and I've made it this far. But if you want to be someone I can respect. That would matter more than biology ever did." And with that, she walked out into the morning sun, leaving Elias alone, the sketch in one hand, and his profound, aching silence in the other. Elias sat in the back of his limousine, the hand-drawn sketch still clutched in his hand. He hadn't spoken a word since leaving the cafe, his mind a tumultuous sea of emotions. His driver, a woman who had worked for Elias for years, knew when silence wasn't just quiet, but sacred. She drove in comfortable stillness, observing the powerful man in her rearview mirror, his usual impenetrable facade fractured by a vulnerability she had never witnessed. He stared at the portrait Coraline had drawn at age 10. The pencil lines were shaky, hesitant, the proportions imperfect, the figures almost childlike in their simplicity. But there was something in it, something heartbreakingly hopeful. A child imagining a man she'd never met, yet daring to believe he could be good, worthy of connection. It was an act of faith, a leap of imagination he had never allowed himself. When he returned to the penthouse, Elias went straight to his study. No coat removed, no lights turned on. The late afternoon sun filtered in through the tall windows, casting long, dramatic shadows across the vast, empty floor. He walked to his desk, his movements deliberate, imbued with a newfound purpose. He unlocked the bottom drawer, the one he hadn't opened in years, the one that held the fragments of a past he had systematically erased. Inside were 3 envelopes yellowed with time, all addressed in the same delicate, familiar handwriting. Adeline's. He picked up the first one, his fingers steady, now devoid of the trembling that had afflicted him for days. He opened it for the second time in his life, the first time having been a fleeting, panicked glance, before consigning it to this drawer. There was no more avoidance now. The faded ink on the page held the echoes of a young woman's pain and profound love. Dear Elias, if you're reading this, it means you've stopped pretending the past didn't matter. I wish I had been braver. I wish you had too. I left because I was told to, because I was afraid of what your name, your family, your world would do to our future. I was alone. I didn't tell you because I didn't want our child to grow up knowing she was the result of shame, but she isn't. She is bright. She is fierce. And she deserves more than a ghost for a father. If she finds you one day, I hope you remember how to love out loud. Adeline. Elias sat back in his chair, the paper trembling in his hands now, a tremor born not of fear, but of a shattering grief and profound regret. He'd built a career on controlling every outcome, anticipating every risk, meticulously planning every move. But no business deal, no hostile takeover, no investor had ever left him this exposed, this vulnerable, this utterly undone. And yet, Coraline had, with a look, with a drawing, with a single challenging sentence, "Be someone I can respect." He folded the letter this time with meticulous care and placed it in his inner coat pocket. This one he would keep close, a constant reminder of the truth he had denied for so long. Coraline didn't tell Miss Anya Sharma about the meeting right away. That night she just sat at the kitchen table slicing apples with robotic precision, listening to the evening news hum softly in the background. Miss Anya, with her intuitive wisdom, knew better than to press. She simply continued her quiet work, creating a space of comfort and patience. Finally, Coraline spoke, her voice flat, emotionless. He brought a picture. Miss Anya turned from the stove, her eyes wide with surprise. Of who? My mother, pregnant, standing by the river. The older woman slowly sat down across from her, her expression softening. He kept it all these years. Coraline nodded. Never opened the envelope until last week. Miss Anya let out a slow, understanding breath. Guilt's a strange thing. She mused, her gaze distant. Sometimes it grows quieter the longer you ignore it, convincing you it's gone. But when it finally speaks child, it doesn't whisper. It shouts. Coraline set the knife down, the precise movements suddenly abandoning her. He said he loved her, said he didn't know about me. Do you believe him? I don't know, Coraline admitted, the honesty, raw, vulnerable. I want to, but I don't know if that's because it's true or because I need it to be. Miss Anya reached across the table and placed a weathered hand over Coraline's, her touch warm and reassuring. Needing something doesn't make it any less real, she said gently, just makes it human. The next morning, Elias Thorne made another call, this one to his lawyer, Arthur Caldwell. I need to amend my will, he said, his voice devoid of his usual detached authority. There was a pause on the other end, a flicker of surprise from the usually unflappable attorney. Are we talking percentages or people, Mr. Thorne? Both, Elias said, his gaze fixed on the letter from Adeline now resting on his desk. There's someone I need to include. Her name is Coraline Hayes. Caldwell didn't ask more. He'd been with Elias too long to be surprised by the unexpected, but even so, he said gently, That's a big step, sir. Are you sure? No, Elias said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. But it's the first step I've been afraid of in years. That tells me it matters. After hanging up, Elias spent the rest of the day reviewing old documents, foundation plans, property deeds, and significantly letters Adeline had once sent to his office, letters that had never made it past his assistant's desk, stamped with a stark "Return to sender" in red. Adeline had tried to reach him. She hadn't vanished. She had been turned away. The realization was a gut punch, a painful confirmation of his own complicity, his own engineered ignorance. He stared at that envelope for a long time, the faded red stamp a stark symbol of his past indifference. Then, with a new, quiet determination, he placed it next to Coraline's childhood sketch on his desk. If Adeline had fought to be seen, to have her truth acknowledged, he would not let her daughter remain invisible any longer. That evening, Coraline checked her email. A message from Elias Thorne. No subject line, just a simple, profound statement. "You don't owe me anything, but I owe you both acknowledgement. I'm holding a press event in 3 days, not for publicity, for truth. I won't mention your name unless you allow it, but I want to tell the world what I didn't have the courage to say 2 decades ago, that she mattered, and so do you." Coraline read the message 3 times, her heart thrumming a strange rhythm in her chest. Then she closed her laptop and stepped out onto the apartment balcony. The metropole city stretched below her, vast and indifferent, its lights a cold, impersonal glow. And yet somewhere in it, something was shifting. Something ancient like silence breaking after too many years, a long-held secret, finally finding its voice. She didn't know yet if she wanted the world to know her name to be tethered to this powerful, complex man. But she knew one thing. If Elias spoke, if he truly stood up not for her, but for the woman who raised her for Adeline, then maybe she wouldn't have to carry the weight of being forgotten anymore. Inside, she opened her old sketchbook, the one her mother had given her on her 15th birthday. On the first page, a note in Adeline's flowing handwriting: "Art is truth with a heartbeat. Use it when the world stops listening." Coraline smiled, a fragile, hopeful curve of her lips. She grabbed her pencil and began to draw again. Not out of anger or grief, not out of a need for justice, but because the silence, the oppressive weight of the unspoken, had finally started to make room for her own voice. 3 days later, the Thorn Foundation held its annual winter press conference. The air was sharp with January cold, the kind that cut through even the finest wool coats, a stark contrast to the stifling humidity of Azalea Coast summers. The venue was the grand atrium of the Thorn Nexus Tower, a cathedral of commerce with glass walls, marble floors, and a podium that had seen 100 photo opportunities, 100 carefully crafted announcements of power and profit. It had never, however, witnessed a confession. Elias Thorn stood behind the velvet curtain, adjusting his tie for the 5th time, his usual composure rattled by an unfamiliar nervous energy. His assistant handed him the speech he'd written, edited, and rewritten again, a carefully structured narrative designed to explain, to manage, to control. He folded it in half, then again, then tucked it into his jacket pocket. He wouldn't be reading it. "Coraline's not here," the assistant whispered, checking the front row, a flicker of concern in her eyes. "At least, not that we can see." Elias nodded, once a gesture of quiet acceptance. "That's all right. This isn't about who's watching." Then, with a profound sense of resolve, he stepped out onto the stage. The crowd of journalists and cameras greeted him with the usual blinding flashes and expectant murmurs. They expected a donation announcement, a development update, perhaps the unveiling of a new skyscraper, another monument to his empire. They didn't expect him to walk up to the microphone without a single slide, without a single branding banner behind him, just a man stripped bare of his usual protective armor. "Good morning," he said, his voice, usually resonating with authority, echoed softly against the high glass ceiling, a stark contrast to the booming pronouncements they were used to. "Thank you for being here. Today I was supposed to talk to you about investment growth and community expansion, about the future of Thorn Industries. But instead, I'm going to talk about something else. Something I should have said a long time ago." He looked down, his fingers brushing the folded speech in his pocket, a silent rejection of the prepared words. Then he met their eyes again, his gaze clear, unwavering, imbued with a newfound truth. "In 2001, I fell in love with a woman named Adeline Hayes." He began the name, once buried deep, now spoken aloud, filling the vast space. "She was a painter. She was brilliant, stubborn, compassionate, and she was black." A few people in the audience shifted in their seats, a ripple of quiet surprise, perhaps discomfort. Elias didn't flinch. He continued, his voice gaining strength, his words precise, unyielding. "At the time, I let fear guide my silence. My family, my reputation, my status, my perceived legacy. I let all of it speak louder than my heart. I walked away from her. I didn't fight for her. I told myself it was for the best for both of us. But the truth is, I was a coward." Gasps rippled quietly through the room, hushed and audible. One camera clicked louder than the rest, capturing the raw, unprecedented moment. "I didn't know that when she left she was pregnant." Elias continued the words, a painful admission, a public revelation of a decades-long omission. "She didn't tell me. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she didn't trust me to stay, to stand by her, to value her over my own convenience. And I don't blame her. I had given her no reason to trust me." Elias paused, letting the room settle into the profound weight of what he had just said, allowing the truth to sink in, to resonate. 21 years later, her daughter found me. Not with a lawyer, not with anger, not with demands for retribution or wealth. Just a quiet voice, and a question I wasn't ready for. "Hi, sir. My late father had the same birthmark. Right there." He lifted his hand briefly, his thumb brushing the inside of his left wrist, a silent public testament to the mark that had shattered his carefully constructed world. "I don't tell you this for sympathy," he stated, his voice now imbued with a quiet power, a newfound authority that transcended his usual corporate gravitas. "I tell you because silence has a cost, because love is not something we should be afraid to speak, no matter how powerful we are, how much we have to lose, because the absence of action can be a betrayal just as deep as a lie." He stepped back from the microphone for a breath, his chest rising and falling, a visible sign of the emotional effort this confession demanded. Then he added, his voice low, filled with a quiet, fierce resolve. "I failed two people and I can't change that, but I will spend the rest of my life honoring them." Then he walked off stage. No questions, no press release, just the truth finally profoundly spoken aloud. Across the city, Coraline sat on the worn couch in Miss Anya Sharma's living room laptop, opened the live stream playing. The image was grainy, pixelated, but the words Elias's words came through, clearly resonating with an undeniable force. She didn't move. Not when he said her mother's name, the sound of it for the first time, not a whisper from her own lips, but a public declaration. Not when he called himself a coward, stripping away the layers of his carefully cultivated image. Not even when he described her voice, the quiet voice that had initiated this seismic shift. Only when he lifted his wrist, revealing the crescent birthmark to the world, did she exhale a long, shaky breath, as if a lifetime of held tension was finally releasing. Miss Anya stood nearby, arms folded, a dish towel hanging from her shoulder, her eyes fixed on Coraline's face. "He did it," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet awe. Coraline didn't speak. Her throat felt too tight, choked with a storm of emotions, shock, relief, a profound, unexpected gratitude. "He didn't hide behind lawyers or statements." Miss Anya continued, her voice firm with admiration. "He stood up." Coraline nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the monumental courage it must have taken, but her hands were gripping the edge of the couch cushion so tightly her knuckles turned pale white against her skin, because a part of her had always believed that moment would never come, that men like him, men of immense power and privilege, stayed silent forever, protected by their wealth and influence, that the world let them. And yet he had spoken. He had faced the truth raw and unvarnished. That evening, Coraline walked alone through the sprawling expanse of Riverbend Park, bundled in her mother's old coat, its familiar scent a comforting embrace. The lake wind bit at her cheeks, sharp and invigorating, but she didn't mind. She walked until the sun dipped low, casting a final molten gold over the frozen water, a poignant farewell to the day. When she reached the statue of the painter along the garden path, the one Adeline used to sketch when Coraline was little, she stopped. She pulled out a small white envelope from her bag. She'd written it last night, just in case, a letter that felt both fragile and immensely powerful. She opened it again, reading the words one more time, a quiet confirmation to herself. "Mr. Thorne," it began, her voice echoing in her mind. "Thank you for saying her name. Thank you for saying mine. That day in the cafe, I didn't know what I wanted, but I think I wanted to see if the man you used to be could face the woman I am. You did. And that matters. I don't know where this goes next. I don't know what kind of family we could ever be. But I'm open to one conversation at a time. Coraline." She placed the letter carefully into the bronze hand of the statue, a silent gesture, a symbol more than a communication. It wasn't for anyone to find, not truly. It was for her a tangible act of leaving something behind, of releasing a part of her burden into the quiet world. Then she turned and walked away, her boots crunching softly in the fresh snow, each step a movement towards an unknown future. Elias found the letter on his desk the next morning, delivered in a simple white envelope with no return address, a stark contrast to the usual meticulously sorted mail that filled his inbox. He read it 3 times, each word a balm to his aching soul. His eyes stung, but he didn't wipe them away, allowing the profound emotion to wash over him. He placed it gently beside Adeline's old return letters and Coraline's childhood sketch, a trio of silenced voices finally being heard. 3 hands on a table, 3 stories no longer hidden. And for the first time in decades, Elias Thorne didn't feel alone in his vast, silent office. He felt seen. and maybe, just maybe, he could be someone worth seeing. 2 days after the press conference, Coraline stood in front of a full-length mirror in the back room of a downtown art gallery. Her palms were sweating, a nervous flutter in her stomach. She wasn't used to wearing heels or blazers or anything that made her look like she belonged on a panel speaking to an audience of strangers. And yet, there she was, scheduled to speak at a community forum on art and identity, standing under a banner that read, "Legacy and Visibility Stories Unforgotten." Her sketchbook was tucked under her arm, worn and frayed, its corners curling from years of being opened and reopened, a repository of her life's unspoken truths. On the front page, she had drawn her mother's eyes the night before. Not perfectly, not a precise rendition, but with care, with love, with a profound understanding. She thought it might give her courage, not for the speech itself, but for whatever came after, for the profound shift her life was undergoing. The invitation to the forum had come the morning after Elias's press conference, not from him, but from the gallery director, a woman who had read Coraline's blog and seen the powerful resonance of her story. "You've got a voice," the director had said, her eyes shining with conviction. "We'd be honored if you used it here." Coraline had said yes before she had time to second-guess herself, a spontaneous act of embracing her newfound visibility. Miss Anya Sharma waited for her near the entrance of the gallery, bundled in her Sunday coat, her eyes gleaming with pride, a silent pillar of support. "He's coming," she whispered when Coraline joined her, her voice a low, knowing murmur. Coraline didn't need to ask who. Elias arrived alone. No assistant, no camera crew, no gleaming limousine. Just a quiet presence in a dark wool coat standing by the door, as if unsure he belonged, a figure of immense power radiating a surprising humility. Their eyes met across the murmuring crowd. He nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement. Coraline didn't smile, not yet, but she didn't look away, holding his gaze, a silent conversation passing between them. The panel began with questions about community memory, forgotten voices, and the profound importance of personal archives, of preserving narratives that might otherwise be lost. Coraline listened quietly, absorbing the words until the moderator finally turned to her, her expression one of thoughtful anticipation. "Coraline Hayes," the moderator said, her voice clear and resonant, "you've lived through a personal discovery that speaks to something larger about race, silence, and family. What do you think we risk when we let history remain untold?" Coraline took the microphone slowly, her fingers gripping it tighter than she meant to, feeling its cold weight, its symbolic power. "I think," she began, her voice surprisingly steady, filling the vast space, "we risk turning people into shadows, not just in public records or newspaper archives where their names might disappear, but in our own lives, in our very sense of self. We forget who gave us the shape of our nose, the tone of our laugh, the unique curve of our spirit. We pretend silence is safety," she continued, her voice imbued with a quiet conviction. "But it's not. It's a kind of theft, a profound, insidious theft." A pause, then quietly, her gaze sweeping across the room, briefly meeting Elias's eyes, a face that held both sorrow and a burgeoning pride. "My mother was erased, not loudly, not violently, but gradually, insidiously, and I lived with the echo of that absence, the void of her unacknowledged story. I didn't know my father's name until recently, but I always knew there was something missing, something deliberate, a silence that felt like a planned omission. I don't speak today to shame anyone," she continued, her voice clear, resolute, "not to accuse or condemn. I speak because every child deserves to be known. Not just as someone's daughter defined by their parentage, but as someone with a story that matters, a narrative that deserves to be heard. And sometimes," she concluded, her voice gaining strength, "it takes 21 years and a single birthmark to begin telling it." The room was still for a long, profound moment, the silence broken only by the soft, almost reverent rustle of clothing and a few suppressed sniffles. Then quiet applause began, tentative at first, then growing slowly swelling, finally filling the space with something more than mere approval, something like release, something like shared understanding, something like hope. Afterward, Elias waited by the refreshment table holding a paper cup of black coffee. He hadn't touched, his gaze fixed on Coraline as she mingled, accepting quiet congratulations. When she approached, he straightened his posture, shifting a subtle deference in his bearing. "You spoke like someone who knows herself," he said gently, his voice low, filled with a quiet admiration. "I'm trying to," she replied, her gaze steady, accepting his compliment with a newfound grace. There was a pause between them. Not tense, not awkward, but honest, filled with the unspoken weight of their evolving relationship. "I meant what I said," Elias continued, his voice firm, sincere. "I don't want to push myself into your life, Coraline, but I want to be there. If there's room, even just a corner." Coraline looked down, then up again, her expression thoughtful, vulnerable. "I don't have answers. I still feel fragile around all this. Around you." "I know," he said, his voice soft, understanding. "But I think maybe we could take one step at a time, a slow, deliberate path." Elias allowed himself a small, tentative smile, a rare glimpse of genuine warmth. "I can walk slowly." They stood in silence for a few moments more, watching people mingle, listening to the sound of conversation ripple around them, a mundane backdrop to their profound, quiet exchange. Then Coraline pulled something from her bag, a small wrapped box. "Here," she said, offering it, her hand outstretched. He opened it carefully, his fingers unhurried, as if unwrapping something infinitely precious. Inside was a framed print of the sketch she had drawn at age 10, the one she had shown him at the cafe. Her mother herself and the imagined father, all three with matching crescent birthmarks on their wrists. But now Coraline had added something new, a powerful, tender addition, a caption at the bottom, handwritten in pencil. "We were never lost, just waiting to be found." Elias's fingers curled around the frame, his eyes watering, but he didn't wipe them away. The tears were not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming recognition. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "for letting me be part of your truth." Coraline nodded. "Truth deserves witnesses," she replied, her voice soft yet resolute. "Even late ones." They didn't hug. Not yet. The moment was too new, too fragile for such a physical manifestation of connection. But they stood closer now, side by side. Not as father and daughter in the full, easy sense of the word, but as two people who were no longer pretending they hadn't once been bound by silence. And now, finally, they were bound by something deeper, recognition, choice, and the slow, sacred act of rebuilding. Outside, snow began to fall soft and steady, dusting the city with a pristine white. Elias offered his coat. Coraline shook her head, smiled just a little, a genuine luminous smile, and said, "Let's walk." And so they did. Under the quiet falling sky, each step a small promise, a shared commitment to a path, however uncertain, that they would now navigate together. Azalea Coast smelled the same. Wet earth heavy with the scent of sweet decay. Spanish moss hanging like ancient whispered secrets from the gnarled branches of the live oak trees. Coraline hadn't been back since her mother's funeral 8 years ago, and stepping off the train felt like walking into a memory, a vivid dream soaked in sunlight and profound silence. Elias Thorne stood beside her, both hands wrapped carefully around a generous bouquet of white camellias, their pristine petals a stark contrast to the raw, earthy scent of the cemetery. He had offered to drive them from the station to whisk them away in a luxurious car, but Coraline had declined. She wanted to walk. She wanted the ache in her legs, the physical exertion to match the ache in her chest, the emotional weight of this pilgrimage. She didn't want this to be easy. They made their way through the old district in silence, a companionable quietude that spoke volumes. They passed cobblestone alleys, narrow and winding, and wooden porches with rocking chairs still swaying gently in the unseen breeze as if awaiting phantom occupants. Every few steps, Elias looked as if he wanted to speak, a question forming on his lips, a thought yearning for expression, but he didn't. And for once, Coraline didn't feel the need to fill the silence. Some things, some truths didn't need words. They simply existed, palpable and profound. When they reached Quietude Gardens, the old cemetery nestled on the edge of town, the late afternoon sun spilled through the magnolia branches, dappling the gravestones with soft, ephemeral gold. Coraline paused at the ornate iron gate, her hand resting on the cool metal. Elias did too, mirroring her hesitant stillness. "She used to bring me here on Sunday afternoons," Coraline said, her voice soft, distant, a memory retrieved from the deep recesses of her childhood. Not just to visit Grandma. She'd sketched the trees the angels carved into the stone, the way light touches stone, illuminating forgotten details. She said even cemeteries had stories worth telling if you only knew how to listen. She always saw what others overlooked, Elias said, his voice low, imbued with a deep understanding, a shared reverence. "She saw me once when I didn't know how to be seen, when I was hiding even from myself." They followed the winding gravel path until they reached the headstone. Simple, weathered. The engraved letters were slightly chipped from time, blurred by years of sun and rain, but still clear, still legible. Adeline A. Hayes, 1979-2015. She painted silence into color. Coraline knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the etched letters of her mother's name. She didn't cry. Not today. The grief had settled into a quieter place now, a deep, pervasive ache that was no longer raw, no longer a fresh wound, but a part of her forever. Elias stepped forward and gently placed the bouquet of white camellias at the base of the grave, the pristine flowers, a silent offering. He remained standing, his tall frame unmoving, his expression unreadable, a quiet monument of regret and love. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out something wrapped in velvet. "I wasn't sure when I'd give this to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with emotion. "But I think this is the right place, the right moment." He handed her the object. Coraline unwrapped it slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a delicate silver locket, oval, worn smooth with time, its surface bearing the subtle patina of age. She opened it. On one side was a small, faded photograph of her mother at 20, laughing, her eyes shining with youthful exuberance. On the other, a small pressed flower, a white camellia, its dried petals a fragile testament to a long-lost moment. "She gave this to me once," Elias said, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the immense emotional effort this revelation cost him. "After our last night together before she left. I didn't wear it. I didn't even open it again until last week, after you found me." Coraline held it in her hand, her thumb tracing the smooth edge of the locket, feeling the cool metal against her skin. "She always loved giving people pieces of herself," she said, her voice soft, reflective. "Tiny ones. Like she was afraid to give too much, afraid of the pain of losing it. She gave me more than I deserved," Elias said, his voice raw with regret, "and far more than I ever acknowledged." They stood in silence again, broken only by the soft rustle of wind through the magnolias, a mournful, quiet song. "She never wanted to be anyone's burden," Coraline said, her gaze fixed on the headstone. "Not even mine. When she got sick, she used to leave voice notes on her phone just in case she didn't make it. I still have them. I don't listen often, but sometimes I need her voice more than her advice." Elias looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sorrow, a grief not just for Adeline, but for the years of absence. "I wish I could have been there for her." He said the words, a heartfelt regret. "For both of you, to ease her burden." "You weren't," Coraline replied, not harshly, not with bitterness, but with a quiet, undeniable honesty. It was a simple statement of fact, not an accusation. "But you're here now, and you're not hiding." He gave a slow nod, acknowledging the truth of her words, the magnitude of his presence. "No, I'm not." Coraline knelt again and placed the locket gently beside the flowers at the foot of the grave, a silent offering, a symbolic reunion. "I think she would have liked this," she said quietly, her voice imbued with a gentle certainty. "Not because it's perfect, not because it fixes anything, but because it's real, because it's truth finally acknowledged." They stayed until the sun dipped low beneath the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the gravestones. Neither wanted to be the first to leave to break the solemnity of the moment, but eventually the chill crept in, a physical reminder of the passing time. Coraline turned to go. Elias lingered a moment longer, his fingers brushing the top of the stone, a final silent farewell. Then he followed. As they walked back down the path, the gravel crunching beneath their feet, Elias broke the silence, his voice thoughtful, reflective. "When I was young, my father told me that emotion was weakness. That dignity meant silence, that control was everything. He built an empire on that philosophy, but your mother Coraline, she proved him wrong with every bold, unapologetic brushstroke she ever made. She painted truth into existence." Coraline looked over at him, a subtle understanding passing between them. "You don't need to be your father," she said gently, her voice an offer, a quiet permission. He met her eyes, a flicker of vulnerability, a nascent strength. "I know. I'm trying not to be." As they reached the gate, Coraline paused, looking back at the quiet expanse of the cemetery. "I want to come back here," she said, a quiet resolve in her voice. "Every year on this day." "I'll come with you," Elias said, his voice firm, unwavering. It was not a request, but a promise. Coraline gave a small nod, a subtle acknowledgement of his commitment. "We'll see." Outside the cemetery, they stopped beneath a tree heavy with magnolia blossoms, just beginning to bud their waxy petals, promising future beauty. Elias reached into his coat again and pulled out an envelope. He handed it to her, his expression serious, a hint of trepidation in his eyes. "What's this?" she asked, a curious frown on her face. "Something I had written before we left Metropole City," he replied, his gaze steady. "It's not legal, not official, just words. Mine. A confession, perhaps. Or a hope." Coraline unfolded the paper. It was a handwritten letter, neat and deliberate, the careful script a stark contrast to the emotional weight of its contents. "Dear Coraline, I missed your birth, your first steps, your scraped knees, and late-night fevers. I missed your drawings on the fridge, your first heartbreak, your triumphs, your struggles. I missed everything. But if you'll let me, I'd like to be here for what comes next. You don't have to forgive me. Not now. Perhaps not ever. But I hope you'll let me earn a place in your life, not because of obligation, not because of biology, but because you believe I can add something true to it. Elias?" Coraline folded the letter slowly, her fingers tracing the neat lines of his confession, his plea. She tucked it into her coat, a new fragile treasure. "Let's get some coffee," she said, surprising herself with the sudden, quiet invitation. "There's a place 2 blocks from here. It's not fancy, but their peach cobbler is exactly the way she used to make it." Elias smiled, and for the first time it wasn't tentative, not hesitant. It was genuine, a profound warmth blooming behind his eyes, reaching them, crinkling the corners. "Lead the way," he said, his voice light, filled with a quiet hope. They walked side by side down the quiet Azalea Coast Street. No headlines, no expectations, no demanding whispers of the past. Just 2 people. Once strangers, now something else. Something still unshaped, still defining itself, but undeniably alive. And above them, the magnolia branches swayed, whispering stories. Only the ancient trees remembered stories of love and loss, and the quiet, enduring power of truth. The cafe in Azalea Coast was nothing special. Brick walls painted a cheerful white, a squeaky fan overhead stirring the humid air, a chalkboard menu with smudged lettering, and a tip jar shaped like a mason jar labeled, "Give what you can get what you need." But for Coraline, it felt like home. It was one of the few places her mother used to take her when the cancer treatments allowed for small stolen joys, small moments of normalcy. Adeline had loved the peach cobbler here, its sweet, comforting warmth a small solace. Coraline remembered her humming quietly over a steaming cup of tea, a napkin in her lap, sketching strangers with a pen that always seemed to run out of ink halfway through, leaving a trail of unfinished portraits. Now, decades later, Coraline sat at the same table across from the man who might have once sat here too. If life had gone differently, if he'd made a different choice, if he'd chosen love over legacy, over the demands of his powerful family. Elias took a small bite of cobbler, savoring the taste, perhaps tasting the ghost of a shared past. "Your mother had good taste," he said, a quiet appreciation in his voice. "She usually did," Coraline said softly, her voice tinged with a faint, bitter irony, except when it came to trusting silence. He nodded, accepting the sting of her words, the direct truth of her observation. She was right. He had been silent, and that silence had been a betrayal. "She deserved more than what I gave her," he said, his voice low, filled with profound regret. "She deserved to be fought for. She deserved a champion." Coraline watched him for a moment, her gaze searching, assessing. "Why didn't you?" She asked the question direct, unvarnished, a mirror held up to his past. His fork paused midair, laden with another bite of cobbler. He set it down slowly, deliberately, then looked her directly in the eye, his expression vulnerable, exposed. "I was raised to believe the world belonged to men like me," he confessed, his voice quiet, raw. "As long as we didn't make waves, as long as we conformed, as long as we prioritized power over personal desire. My father made it clear, love her, and you lose everything, money, respect, inheritance, your place in this family. And I was too young or too cowardly to see that what I lost by staying quiet was infinitely greater than anything they could have taken from me." Coraline didn't respond right away. She simply sipped her tea, letting his words settle in the space between them, the weight of his confession hanging in the quiet air. His father's words a chilling echo of the destructive power of generational expectations. "You said something at the gallery." Elias continued, his gaze steady, sincere. "About being known, not just as someone's daughter, but as someone with a story that matters." "Coraline," he said, his voice gaining a quiet intensity, "I want you to know you matter. Not because you're my daughter, Not because of our shared biology, but because of who you've become despite everything I wasn't. The words weren't perfect, perhaps, but they were real, profoundly authentic, and that mattered more than any eloquence. Coraline looked down at the locket now hanging from a thin silver chain around her neck, the one he'd given her at the cemetery. She rubbed her thumb over its smooth, worn surface, a physical connection to the past, to her mother. "You know, I used to imagine you showing up at school when I was little," she said, her voice soft, distant, a memory pulled from the depths of her childhood longing. "Standing by the door at parent-teacher night, just once. I didn't care if you were rich or famous. I just wanted someone to show up, to claim me." Elias's jaw tightened, a visible clench of regret, of a pain that could never be truly assuaged. "I hate that I wasn't there." He whispered the words in anguished admission. "I don't need you to hate it," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "I need you to carry it, so you don't repeat it, so you remember the cost of inaction." He nodded slowly, a profound understanding passing between them. "I'm trying." Coraline leaned back in her chair, a sigh escaping her lips. "And I'm trying to let you. That's the hard part, learning to trust the possibility of presence." Outside the cafe, rain had begun to fall, a soft, warm southern rain that felt more like memory than weather. The kind her mother used to paint as streaks of watercolor blue on brown paper, capturing its gentle, pervasive melancholy. Coraline stood and pulled her coat around her shoulders. "Walk me to the train station." "Of course," Elias said, already reaching for his umbrella, a silent, unequivocal acceptance of her request, her invitation. They walked slowly down the wet sidewalk, neither speaking at first. The sound of the rain, a soft curtain around them. They passed old bookstores, their windows glowing with the promise of untold stories, and empty porches, their rocking chairs still and silent. They moved in step, the sound of their shoes muted by the gentle rain, a rhythm of quiet companionship. At the station, Maya paused under the awning, the shelter a temporary reprieve from the soft drizzle. "This doesn't fix everything," she said, her voice thoughtful, realistic. "There's a lot we won't get back. Years, memories, a lifetime." "I know," he said, his voice quiet, accepting. "But it's something. A start, a new path." She studied him. This man who looked like power, who exuded control, but now carried humility in his spine like a new kind of strength, a quiet, profound resilience. "My mom once said that love wasn't just about being there," Coraline said, her voice soft, recalling her mother's wisdom. "It was about staying, even when it's inconvenient, even when it hurts, even when the world tells you to leave." "I'm not leaving," Elias said, his voice firm, resolute, a promise etched in the quiet air. She looked at him for a moment longer, then did something she hadn't done before, something that felt both momentous and utterly natural. She stepped forward and hugged him. It wasn't long, it wasn't tight, but it was full. It was an embrace filled with unspoken forgiveness, with tentative acceptance, with a profound shared understanding. And when she pulled away, she said, her voice imbued with a quiet hope, "Next year, same day, Magnolia Tree. I'll be there." He smiled, something warm blooming behind his eyes, lighting them from within. "I'll be there," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Even if you're not, I will be here." She stepped onto the train without looking back. Not because she didn't care, not because she was indifferent, but because she finally didn't have to wonder if he'd disappear. Not anymore. Elias stood on the platform long after the train pulled away, a silent sentinel. His umbrella lay forgotten at his side, the rain tracing lines down his face, blurring the boundaries between water and tears. But he didn't move. He felt them not as drops, but as permission. Permission to feel, permission to regret, permission to rebuild, to finally, truly live. Back in Metropole City, a week later, Coraline returned to the art studio where she taught on weekends, a familiar sanctuary of creativity and shared expression. One of her students, a girl barely 10, her eyes wide with a child's earnest curiosity, asked her if grown-ups ever got scared. "All the time," Coraline answered with a smile, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "But some of them keep showing up. They keep trying even when it's hard. That's where the real bravery lies." Later that night, she added a new drawing to her sketchbook, a quiet act of creative catharsis. It was of 3 hands, one weathered and strong, one youthful and resilient, and one that held both a bridge between generations. And on each wrist, drawn with meticulous care, the same crescent birthmark. Not a label, not a burden, but a legacy rewritten. Sometimes Coraline reflected family isn't built in hospital rooms or at festive holiday dinners, not in the traditional easy ways. Sometimes it's forged in rain and silence, in the quiet solitude of shared grief. Sometimes it's built in truth spoken late years after it should have been uttered, but spoken nonetheless. And sometimes, profoundly irrevocably, it begins with a choice someone once failed to make, a choice that finally, courageously is made. The future was unwritten, filled with unknowns, but for the first time, Coraline felt a profound sense of peace. The story finally was truly her own. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. This wasn't just a tale of family and legacy. It was a heartwarming story about silence, truth, and the courage to show up. Maybe for you, it echoed a real-life story, or maybe it reminded you of someone you've lost, or someone you're still waiting for. Wherever you're watching from in the world, thank you. Your presence here means more than you know. If this story touched your heart, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, or sharing it with someone who needs a story like this before sleep. A quiet, honest bedtime story to remind us we're not alone. And now I'd love to hear from you. What did this story stir up in you? Drop a comment. Tell me where you're from. Let this space be one where stories bring us closer. Your support keeps these stories alive. Truly. Until the next chapter, with gratitude and heart. See you again soon.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.